What became of the family behind one of the most feared and powerful men in all of Nazi Germany? Hermann Göring stood at Hitler's right hand for more than a decade, commanding the Luftwaffe, plundering the art collections of an entire continent, and living in a level of opulence that shocked even those who knew him well. He wore jewels on his fingers, dressed in costumes that ranged from medieval hunting garb to white silk tunics, and presided over a vast country estate that bore the name of his dead first wife like a monument to grief and vanity in equal measure. When Germany collapsed in May 1945 and the Third Reich crumbled into rubble and ruin, Göring's world came crashing down with extraordinary speed. He was arrested, tried at Nuremberg, and sentenced to death, only to cheat the hangman's noose by swallowing a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. But what of those he left behind? What happened to the wife who had stood faithfully at his side through the years of power and the years of disgrace? What became of the daughter who had been raised in palace-like splendor, gifted with stolen masterpieces and baptized into a world of criminality she was far too young to understand? And what of the remarkable brother who spent the entire war doing the exact opposite of everything the Göring name came to represent? The story of Hermann Göring's family after World War II is one of the most complex, surprising, and deeply human stories to emerge from the wreckage of the Nazi era. It involves trials and denazification hearings, lost art and legal battles, acts of extraordinary courage, decades of stubborn silence, and the long, grinding burden of carrying one of history's most infamous surnames. In this video, we will find out what truly happened to the people who bore the Göring name after the war ended. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. To understand what happened to Göring's family, we first need to understand the man himself, and more importantly, the world he created around those he loved. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, the son of Dr. Heinrich Ernst Göring, a former governor of German Southwest Africa, and Franziska Tiefenbrunn. From his earliest years, Hermann displayed the kind of swaggering confidence that would define his entire life. He trained as a military aviator and became one of Germany's greatest fighter aces during the First World War, scoring 22 confirmed aerial victories and earning the prestigious Pour le Mérite, the empire's highest military decoration. After the armistice of 1918 and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Göring drifted through Scandinavia as a stunt pilot and aviation instructor, and it was during this period that he would meet the woman who would become the great love of his life, the woman after whom he would eventually name his most prized possession. Her name was Carin von Kantzow, a Swedish aristocrat of extraordinary beauty and fierce devotion, and her story, even in death, would shape the fate of the Göring family for decades to come. Karin Göring, née Fock, was born on October 21, 1888, in Stockholm, Sweden, into the minor Swedish nobility. Her father was Carl Fock, an officer of the Swedish military, and her mother was Huldine Beamish, who was of Irish descent. Karin grew up in a world of refinement and culture, speaking multiple languages and moving in elevated social circles. By the time she met Hermann Göring in Sweden in 1920, she was already married to a Swedish army officer named Niels von Kantzow, with whom she had a young son, Thomas. The meeting between Karin and Hermann was, by all accounts, immediate and overwhelming. She was tall, ethereally beautiful, and possessed of a mystical, spiritual quality that her contemporaries often described in near-religious terms. Göring, the broad-shouldered, boisterous war hero, was instantly captivated. The two began a passionate affair that scandalized Swedish society and ultimately led to Karin's divorce from Niels von Kantzow in 1922. She gave up custody of her beloved son Thomas in order to be with Hermann, a sacrifice that haunted her for the rest of her life. The couple married in February 1923 in Munich, and Karin threw herself into the world of National Socialism with a fervour that exceeded even Hermann's own. She attended Nazi Party meetings, opened their Munich apartment to Hitler and his inner circle, and became something of a romantic icon within the early movement, the loyal aristocratic wife standing behind the heroic fighter pilot. Her fragile health, however, was a constant shadow over their happiness. Karin suffered from tuberculosis and a chronic heart condition, and the physical and emotional strains of life in the turbulent Weimar Republic took a devastating toll. When the beer hall putsch of November 1923 failed and Göring was shot and seriously wounded while marching, alongside Hitler, Karin nursed him through his painful recovery, even as her own strength ebbed away. The couple fled Germany to escape arrest, living in exile across Austria, Italy and Sweden, during which time Göring became dangerously addicted to morphine prescribed to manage his wound pain. Carin stood by him through his addiction, his rehabilitation, and his eventual return to Germany in 1927 after a general amnesty was declared. By the time the Nazi Party began its dramatic rise in the early 1930s, Carin was gravely ill. She had returned to Sweden to be near her family and to seek medical treatment, and it was there, far from her husband and the political world that had consumed their lives, that she died on October 17, 1931. She was just 42 years old. Göring was devastated. He rushed to Stockholm but arrived too late to say goodbye. Carin was buried at Löven, an island near Stockholm, surrounded by the Swedish countryside she had grown up loving. Her death left a wound in Göring that, by all accounts, never fully healed. He wore a locket containing her photograph until the very end of his life, and her name would soon be attached to the grandest monument to personal grief in the entire history of the Third Reich. Within 3 years of Carin's death, Göring had risen to become one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, and he used that power, among many other things, to honour the memory of his dead wife in a manner that was simultaneously touching and grotesque. In the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, he began constructing a vast country estate that he named Karinhall in her memory. It was designed to evoke a Scandinavian longhouse with high timber ceilings, stone fireplaces, and rooms filled with hunting trophies, priceless artworks, and antique furniture. Over the years, as Göring's power and his appetite for looting grew, Karinhall expanded into something closer to a palace with underground bunkers, a private railway station, its own airstrip, a model farm, and room after room of paintings, sculptures, tapestries and jewels that had been systematically stripped from private collections, museums and Jewish families across Europe. At the heart of this monument to excess, Göring made one final extraordinary gesture to the wife he had loved and lost. In June 1934, he arranged for Carin's remains to be exhumed from their resting place in Sweden and transported to Germany, where they were reinterred in a specially constructed mausoleum at Karinhall. A Swedish guard of honour accompanied her coffin on the journey, and a large ceremony was held at Karinhall with leading Nazi figures in attendance. The great love of Hermann Göring's life was now enshrined at the centre of his empire of stolen beauty, and in the years that followed he would visit her tomb regularly, sitting alone with her in the forest silence. But even this most personal of monuments would not survive the war. In late April 1945, with Soviet ES forces closing in on Berlin, Göring personally ordered the demolition of Karinhall. SS engineers packed the building with explosives and detonated them in a controlled series of blasts that reduced the grand estate to rubble, denying the Red Army its capture. Before the explosion, Göring ensured that the most valuable artworks were loaded onto trains and trucks heading south. And in the chaos and confusion of those final days, a question arose that nobody seemed to have a clear answer to. What would happen to Carin's remains? For several chaotic months, her status was unclear. Eventually, in 1951, Swedish authorities and members of the Fock family made arrangements to have Carin's remains returned to Sweden, where she was reinterred at Löven, back in the Swedish soil where she had first been buried in 1931. Today, the ruins of Karinhall are barely visible in the Schorfheide forest, reclaimed almost entirely by nature. The mausoleum foundations remain partially, as do some of the basement structures, but the grand monument that Göring built for his first wife has been swallowed by trees and time. It is a fitting metaphor for the entire Göring legacy, something immense and grotesque reduced to silence and rubble. The story of Carin's son from her first marriage, Thomas von Canso, is one of the quieter but genuinely poignant threads in the entire Göring family story. Thomas was born in 1915, the son of Carin and her first husband, Niels von Canso, and he was just 7 or 8 years old when his mother abandoned the family to be with Hermann Göring. The trauma of that separation stayed with Thomas for many years. He grew up in Sweden with his father and his paternal family, maintaining some contact with his mother before her death in 1931, but the relationship was necessarily complicated and physically distant. When Carin died, Thomas was 16, and whatever chance he might have had to properly reconnect with her was gone forever. His relationship with his stepfather Hermann Göring was, by all accounts, cordial but not particularly close. Göring occasionally invited Thomas to Germany and included him in family gatherings, and Thomas visited Karinhall at various points in the 1930s. He was present at some of the larger social occasions that Göring held at his estates. However, Thomas remained fundamentally a Swedish citizen, living a Swedish life, and as the war dragged on and Göring's reputation darkened, any connection between Thomas and his stepfather became increasingly fraught. After the war, Thomas von Canso kept a notably low profile regarding his connection to the Göring name. He remained in Sweden, where he was known primarily as the son of the much-admired Carin, rather than the stepson of the war criminal, and this distinction mattered enormously in a country that had maintained its neutrality throughout the conflict. Thomas lived out his life in relative obscurity, and it is a measure of how thoroughly he managed to separate himself from the Göring legacy that very little has been recorded about his later years. He died in Sweden, his mother's memory something he seemingly cherished privately, the monstrous stepfather something he preferred not to discuss at all. The Fock family, Karin's Swedish relatives, similarly retreated from any association with the Göring name once the full truth of Herman's crimes became widely understood. They had cooperated with the transfer of Karin's remains back to Sweden in the early 1950s, a gesture that at once honoured their relative and quietly reclaimed her from the Nazi monument that had surrounded her bones for more than a decade. By the time the war ended, however, the dominant presence in what remained of the Göring household was not the ghost of Carin, but the very much living and embattled figure of Emmy Goering. Emmy Sonnemann was born on March 24, 1893 in Hamburg, into a middle-class family with roots in the performing arts. She trained as an actress from her teenage years and built a genuine career on the German stage, working in theatres across the country and developing a reputation as a competent and well-liked performer. She had been married previously to the actor Carl Köstlin, but that marriage had ended in divorce before she encountered Hermann Göring in the early 1930s. The precise details of how Emmy and Göring first met are somewhat disputed in various accounts, but what is clear is that by the time the Nazi Party came to power in 1933 and Göring began his ascent to the highest levels of German governance, Emmy Sonnemann was firmly established in his life. Göring appointed himself Minister-President of Prussia and eventually Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and he pursued Emmy with the same relentless energy he applied to everything else. For Emmy's part, there is little to suggest she was unaware of what the Nazi regime represented. She moved in its highest circles, attended its grandest social functions, and eventually occupied a position at the very apex of the Third Reich's social hierarchy. The couple's wedding on April 10, 1935, was one of the grandest spectacles of the Nazi era. It was held in Berlin and attended by Adolf Hitler himself, who served as a witness to the ceremony. Thousands of Berliners lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the wedding procession. Emmy wore an elaborate gown, and Göring appeared in a white uniform dripping with medals and decorations. Hitler's presence as official witness was a mark of extraordinary social standing, and the event was covered extensively by the regime's propaganda apparatus. The honeymoon took place in Yugoslavia and Scandinavia, with Göring deliberately including a stop near Sweden in what was widely understood as a gesture of respect to the memory of Carin. It was a complicated piece of personal mythology that Emmy seemed to accept without apparent complaint. Life as Emmy Goering in the years between 1935 and 1945 was a study in extraordinary privilege. She lived at Karinhall, at the Göring family's villa near Berlin, at their mountain residence in the Berchtesgaden area, and at various other properties that her husband maintained with the proceeds of his extensive looting and corruption. The household operated on a scale that rivaled the great royal courts of Europe. There were servants, chefs, gamekeepers, art curators, and a small private army of security personnel. Emmy entertained on a lavish scale, hosting dinners for the highest figures in German political and military life. She wore jewellery that had been stripped from European collections and dressed in clothes that were among the most expensive available anywhere in the world. Whether she asked questions about where these things came from is something historians have debated at length. The evidence suggests that Emmy Goering was, at the very least, willfully ignorant of the criminal sources of her husband's enormous wealth. She was not an ideological fanatic in the manner of someone like Himmler's wife Margaret, but she was a willing and enthusiastic beneficiary of a system built on dispossession, terror, and murder. She also retained her connection to the German theatre world, and in one of the war's more documented episodes of her individual influence, she used her position to successfully lobby for the release of several Jewish actors who had been arrested or were facing persecution, a fact that her supporters would later use to argue that she had been a moderating influence. The reality, as with almost everything connected to the senior figures of the Nazi regime, was considerably more complicated. The birth of Edda Goering on June 2, 1938 was celebrated as a major public event. Hermann Göring was overjoyed, having long wanted a child, and he ensured that the birth received maximum publicity. Emmy, who was 45 at the time, had undergone fertility treatment to conceive, and the pregnancy had been something of an open secret in German high society. The child was given the name Edda, which carried faint echoes of the name of Mussolini's daughter, Edda Mussolini-Ciano, reflecting the symbolic weight the Nazis placed on the German-Italian Axis alliance. Adolf Hitler became the child's godfather, attending the baptism and expressing his warmth toward both parents. The gift of Hitler's godparenthood was, in the strange moral calculus of the Third Reich, among the greatest honours that could be bestowed on any family, and Göring's enemies within the Nazi hierarchy were reportedly furious with envy. Edda grew up at Karinhall and at the Göring family's other properties, surrounded by art and luxury on a scale that would have seemed fantastical to almost any other child in Germany or occupied Europe. Among the gifts she received during her early childhood was a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, the renowned German Renaissance master, a Madonna and child of considerable artistic and monetary value. It was one of many significant artworks that found their way into Edda's name during the years of her father's power. She was photographed often, appearing at public events as a symbol of the regime's attempt to project an image of wholesome family life, the beloved daughter of Germany's second most powerful man. As the war turned progressively against Germany after 1942, the Göring family's circumstances began to change in ways that even their formidable social position could not entirely insulate them from. Göring's stock with Hitler fell dramatically following the Luftwaffe's failure during the Battle of Britain, its inability to supply the surrounded Sixth Army at Stalingrad, and the increasing effectiveness of Allied bombing raids against German cities, all of which Göring had promised to prevent. He withdrew increasingly into the fantasy world of Karinhall, adding to his art collection, hosting elaborate hunting parties and dressing in ever more eccentric costumes, while the genuine business of governing and fighting the war passed increasingly to others. Emmy remained loyal, maintaining the household and her husband's social calendar, even as the physical and psychological reality of total war encroached from every direction. In the final months of the conflict, the family retreated from Berlin to their mountain residence at Obersalzberg, near Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, the same alpine redoubt where Hitler and other senior Nazi leaders had their own properties. It was from there that Emmy and Edda, who was now 6 years old, watched the world they had known disintegrate entirely. The final weeks of April 1945 brought a cascade of catastrophes for the Göring family that unfolded with almost theatrical speed. On April 23, 1945, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin and Hitler retreated into his underground bunker, Göring sent a telegram from Berchtesgaden suggesting that since Hitler was effectively cut off, he, Göring, should assume leadership of the Reich in accordance with the succession decree of 1941. Hitler, furious, immediately stripped Göring of all his positions, had him arrested by the SS and expelled him from the Nazi Party for treason. Martin Bormann, who had long conspired against Göring, pressed for his execution, but cooler heads prevailed and Göring was merely held under house arrest at his villa near Berchtesgaden. Emmy and Edda were nearby, living through the chaotic final days of the Nazi regime, watching the sky fill with Allied aircraft and listening to the distant thunder of approaching armies. When American forces arrived in the Berchtesgaden area in early May 1945, Göring surrendered to the 7th United States Army on May 9, 1945. He was charming and cooperative with his captors, apparently believing that his status as a soldier and former leader would result in relatively civilized treatment and perhaps even some role in post-war negotiations. He was, of course, profoundly mistaken. Hermann Göring was taken into American custody and would never see his wife or his daughter as a free man again. He was transferred to the Mondorf-les-Bains detention facility in Luxembourg, known among the prisoners as Ashcan, where he was placed on a strict diet that stripped away the massive weight he had accumulated during years of indulgent living. He was then transferred to Nuremberg to face trial for war crimes, crimes against peace, conspiracy, and crimes against humanity. Emmy and Edda, meanwhile, were left to navigate the catastrophic collapse of everything they had known. The story of Hermann Göring's relationship with morphine is one that deserves more detailed examination than it typically receives in popular histories, partly because it so directly shaped the physical and psychological reality of the household that Emmy and later Edda inhabited, and partly because it illuminates something important about the way in which the Nazi regime accommodated and concealed the private failings of its senior figures. Göring's addiction had its origins in the morphine prescribed to manage the severe pain of the bullet wound he received during the beer hall putsch of November 1923, when an SS man's bullet tore through his groin during the disastrous attempt to march on the Munich city centre and overthrow the Bavarian government. The wound was serious and the pain was genuine, and the morphine that was prescribed to manage it during his initial treatment provided immediate relief. But as Göring and Carin fled into exile, moving from Austria to Italy and finally to Sweden, the drug that had been prescribed as a medical necessity became a dependency that altered Göring's personality, his judgment, and his physical appearance in dramatic ways. He was treated for addiction at the Aspudden Psychiatric Hospital outside Stockholm in 1925 and 1926, where his behaviour during the acute withdrawal phases was reportedly violent and disturbing, marked by delusions, paranoia, and extreme physical distress. Carin stood by him through these episodes, writing letters to his family and to the Nazi Party leadership that presented his condition in the best possible light and maintained the fiction that he was simply unwell rather than addicted. By the time Göring was able to return to Germany after the 1927 amnesty, the worst of the acute addiction had been addressed, but the psychological and physical patterns established during those years of dependence never fully resolved, and his relationship with various medications and stimulants remained a feature of his life throughout the Nazi years, contributing to the weight gain, the erratic behaviour, and the disconnection from operational reality that his military subordinates increasingly complained about as the war turned against Germany. When Emmy entered this picture in the early 1930s, she inherited not just a powerful political figure but a man with a complicated medical history, a deep grief for his dead first wife, and a personality that combined extraordinary charm and sociability with a capacity for self-indulgence and self-deception that was remarkable even by the standards of the Nazi elite. Emmy's response to all of this was, by her own account, one of uncomplicated love and acceptance. She never publicly criticised her husband and rarely even acknowledged the contradictions that were apparent to outside observers. She presented their marriage, in the memoir she eventually published, as a story of genuine partnership and mutual devotion, and there is no strong reason to doubt that this was how she experienced it, even as the evidence suggests that her experience was significantly filtered by her willingness to overlook or rationalise whatever did not fit the narrative she preferred. This capacity for selective perception was not unique to Emmy Goering. It was a quality that seems to have been almost universal among the senior wives of the Nazi leadership, who occupied a social world in which asking difficult questions had very real costs and in which maintaining pleasant domestic surfaces served everyone's interests. But in Emmy's case, the capacity for selective perception extended even to her post-war retrospection. Even to the memoir written more than 20 years after Nuremberg, when there was no longer any practical reason to maintain the fiction that her husband had been essentially innocent of the crimes for which he had been convicted and executed. The specific question of Emmy Goering and the artworks deserves more detailed attention because it sits at the intersection of the personal and the criminal in ways that are particularly revealing. Göring's collection, by the time of the war's end, numbered in the thousands of individual items, and the mechanisms by which he had assembled it were well documented by the investigations conducted by the Allied art looting units in 1945 and 1946. His primary agent in the acquisition of art was a dealer named Walter Andreas Hofer, who had worked for Göring since the late 1930s and who had conducted negotiations for the purchase, exchange, and outright seizure of artworks across occupied Europe. Hofer's records, which survived the war largely intact, provided the Allied investigators with an extraordinarily detailed picture of the collection's assembly, including the prices paid, the parties from whom works had been acquired, and the conditions under which the transactions had taken place. Many of the transactions that technically resembled purchases were in fact coercive sales under conditions in which the sellers, often Jewish families or institutions in occupied countries, had no practical ability to refuse. The prices paid were frequently far below market value, and the currency in which payment was sometimes made was itself the currency of an occupying power that did not recognize the legal rights of those from whom it was buying. The artworks that Göring gave to Edda, including the Cranach Madonna, were items that had passed through this apparatus of acquisition, and the question of whether Emmy was aware of the circumstances in which specific pieces had been obtained was one that the Denazification proceedings attempted to address. Her consistent position was that she had not been involved in or fully informed about the acquisition process, that she had received works as gifts and household decorations without detailed knowledge of their provenance. The investigators found this position partially credible and partially convenient, which is reflected in the relatively mild denazification classification she received. The physical spaces in which the Göring family lived during the Nazi years were themselves extraordinary historical artifacts, and the fates of those spaces after the war reflect something about the broader project of coming to terms with the material legacy of the Third Reich. The Göring family maintained several principal residences during the height of their power. Karinhall in the Schorfheide forest was the grandest and most personally significant. But there was also the Göring family villa in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin, a large and well-appointed property that served as the primary urban residence and the site of many of the most significant social occasions hosted by the couple. There was the mountain residence at Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, where Emmy and Edda spent the war's final months. There was the hunting lodge at Rominton Heath in East Prussia, a remote and spectacular property in a landscape of forests and lakes that Göring had inherited from the imperial state and that he used as a private hunting retreat. Each of these properties had its own staff, its own character, and its own role in the social world of the Nazi elite, and each of them passed through a different process of seizure, occupation, and eventual repurposing in the post-war years. The Berlin villa was badly damaged in the IS bombing of the city during the final year of the war and was eventually demolished. The Berchtesgaden residence was seized by American forces and used for various occupation-era purposes before eventually being returned to German ownership and converted to different uses. The Rominton Heath Lodge, which found itself in Soviet-controlled territory after the war's end, suffered a fate that involved decades of relative neglect before eventually becoming a subject of historical curiosity and occasional tourism in what is now the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia, once the German province of East Prussia. Each site was a physical node in the geography of Göring's power, and their various post-war fates traced the dispersal and disappearance of that power with particular concreteness. The German city of Nuremberg, where the trial that ended Hermann Göring's life was held, is also a city with deep connections to the broader Göring story. It was in Nuremberg that Göring had delivered some of the most significant speeches of the Nazi era, at the massive annual rallies held in the city that Hitler had designated as the symbolic capital of the movement. The Zeppelin Field in Nuremberg, where those rallies were held and where Albert Speer had designed the extraordinary theatrical lighting effects that turn mass rallies into quasi-religious spectacles, became, after the war, a contested space of memory and historical reckoning. Göring's voice had echoed across those grounds on multiple occasions, whipping the assembled crowds into states of fervour and devotion that seem, in historical retrospect, almost incomprehensible in their combination of genuine emotion and catastrophic moral blindness. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, where the trial took place, remained a functioning court building after the war, and today houses a documentation centre and museum about the Nuremberg trials, allowing visitors to sit in the courtroom where Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and the other defendants sat to hear their fates pronounced. Emmy visited that courtroom on the days she was permitted to attend the proceedings, and Edda grew up in a world that was permanently shadowed by what had happened there. The city of Nuremberg itself became, in the decades after the war, a particularly active centre of the German Erinnerungskultur, the culture of remembrance, both because of the trials that had taken place there and because of the particular weight of its role as the showpiece city of Nazi spectacle. For the Göring family, Nuremberg meant something very specific. It was where the judgment had come, where the sentence had been pronounced, where Emmy had watched her husband argue for his life and lose, and where the cyanide capsule had ended the story in a manner that denied the world its final ritual of state justice. Emmy Goering's immediate post-war experience was brutal in its swiftness and completeness. Within days of Germany's surrender, she was arrested by American forces and taken into custody. Edda, who was 7 years old, was taken along with her mother, as there was simply no one else to care for her. Emmy was initially held at various internment facilities in the American occupation zone, separated for long periods from any news about her husband's fate and from the friends and social networks that had sustained her through the war years. The transition from the mistress of Karinhall, the First Lady of the Third Reich's social world, to a prisoner without resources, status or certainty was as complete as any reversal of fortune in the chaotic months following Germany's surrender. Emmy was questioned at length about her husband's activities, about the artworks he had accumulated, about the financial arrangements that had sustained their extraordinary lifestyle, and about the extent of her own knowledge and involvement in the regime's criminal enterprises. Her answers, by all accounts, were consistent and carefully measured. She maintained that she had been a wife and a mother, not a political figure, and that the precise details of her husband's business and official conduct were not something she had been privy to. It was a position that, in the legal and procedural chaos of the immediate post-war period, carried at least some credibility, even if it stretched the limits of plausibility, given the circles in which she had moved and the scale of the wealth she had enjoyed. Emmy was eventually permitted to attend her husband's trial at Nuremberg, where she was able to see him in person for the first time since his arrest. Those visits, conducted under strict supervision in the visiting rooms of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, were deeply emotional affairs. Hermann Göring, who had lost an enormous amount of weight during his imprisonment and had been weaned off his long-standing drug dependency under American medical supervision, was in many ways a more focused and formidable figure than he had been in years. He, drawing a certain reluctant admiration from those who observed the trial. Göring refused to accept the legitimacy of the tribunal and argued that, as a soldier and statesman, he had acted in accordance with the laws and conventions of the time. He accepted personal responsibility for many of his actions, but denied specific allegations of criminality and maintained that he had known nothing of the systematic extermination of the Jews. This last claim was, of course, thoroughly disproved by the documentary evidence presented at trial. Emmy sat in the visitors' gallery on the days when she was permitted to attend, watching her husband argue for his life with the same theatrical confidence he had always brought to every arena. She later described those visits as among the most agonizing experiences of her existence. The Nuremberg Tribunal delivered its verdicts on October 1, 1946. Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. Göring heard the verdict and the sentence without visible emotion, maintaining the studied composure he had projected throughout the trial. Emmy, learning of the sentence, was devastated. She immediately began lobbying for clemency through every available channel, writing letters, petitioning the Allied Control Council, and appealing to anyone who might have influence over the outcome. She visited Herman in his cell in the final days before his scheduled execution on October 15, 1946, and by all accounts their farewell was deeply affecting. She described him as calm, philosophical, and absolutely resolved that he would not hang. And he was true to his word. In the early hours of October 15, 1946, a matter of hours before he was due to be led to the gallows, Hermann Göring bit down on a glass cyanide capsule and died in his cell. The capsule, its origin one of the enduring mysteries of the Nuremberg period, had been concealed with remarkable ingenuity over a long period, and its use denied the Allies the execution they had prepared and denied the world a final accounting from the man himself. Emmy, upon learning of Herman's suicide, reportedly collapsed. She later wrote that she was, in some sense, relieved that he had not been hanged, that he had controlled the manner of his own death, as he had tried to control everything else, even as she grieved the loss of the man she had loved. Hermann Göring was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of in secret to prevent the site from becoming a place of neo-Nazi pilgrimage or commemoration. The exact location where his ashes were scattered or deposited was not publicly confirmed for many decades, though it was eventually established that the remains of Göring and several other executed Nuremberg defendants were disposed of in the Konventsbach stream near Munich. There would be no grave, no monument, no physical place where his admirers could gather. Emmy, in the years that followed, would feel the absence of any clear endpoint, any physical place of mourning, as a particular kind of additional grief. She was left with memories, photographs, and Edda, and very little else. The denazification process that applied to Emmy Goering was handled through the German courts established by the Allied occupation authorities, and its outcome was contested and prolonged. Emmy was classified after considerable deliberation as a Mitläufer, a follower or fellow traveller of the regime, which represented the second lowest of the 5 categories used in denazification proceedings. It was a designation that acknowledged involvement without assigning the highest levels of guilt. The category did, however, have real practical consequences. Emmy was fined and more. Significantly, she was initially subject to restrictions on her ability to work and access certain financial assets. The family's properties, including the various Göring residences, had already been seized by the occupation authorities, and the contents of those properties, artworks, furniture, jewellery, personal effects, and the staggering accumulated material wealth of a decade of criminal looting were subject to various processes of confiscation, restitution to original owners, and government acquisition. Emmy emerged from the denazification process in 1948 without legal conviction as a major offender, but also without almost any of the material wealth that had defined her life during the Nazi years. She was released from formal restriction and left to build a new life with essentially nothing. She was 55 years old, and the world around her had changed beyond recognition. What did Emmy Goering do with the decades that followed? She moved to Munich, where she established a modest household and attempted to live as quietly as possible, given the extraordinary notoriety of her surname. She had some support from former friends and social acquaintances, though many who had been effusive in their affection during the Nazi years proved considerably cooler once the power and prestige that accompanied the Goering name had evaporated. She received a small widow's pension, the level of which was subject to political controversy in post-war Germany, given that she was the widow of a convicted war criminal. Emmy focused her energies on raising Edda, who was still a young child in the late 1940s, and on maintaining a household that, while far from the palatial scale of Karinhall, was at least stable and safe. She kept a low profile in public, declining almost all media requests for interviews and avoiding the political discussions that swirled around former Nazi wives in the post-war years. Friends who knew her during this period described a woman who remained convinced of her husband's fundamental decency, who bristled at what she saw as unfair characterizations of his character, and who was engaged in a permanent internal negotiation between grief and the dawning awareness of the full scale of what the regime he had served had done. Whether Emmy Goering ever fully confronted the reality of the Holocaust and her own family's role in it is something that her later writings suggest she did only partially and with considerable resistance. In 1967, Emmy Goering published her memoir, which she titled An der Seite meines Mannes, meaning At My Husband's Side. The book was a personal account of her life with Hermann Göring, written from her perspective as a wife and mother rather than as a political figure or historian. It attracted considerable attention both in Germany and internationally, partly because Emmy was one of the very few surviving senior Nazi wives to have published a full-length memoir, and partly because the book's tone struck many readers as remarkably unrepentant. Emmy acknowledged the tragedy of the war and expressed grief for the suffering it had caused, but she presented her husband in largely sympathetic terms as a complex and fundamentally loyal man who had been caught up in circumstances that ultimately overwhelmed him. She touched on his art collecting but did not engage seriously with the question of its criminal origins. She mentioned his drug addiction and the periods of poor health that had affected his judgment but framed them as mitigating factors rather than explanations for criminal behaviour. The memoir was criticised by historians for its selective engagement with the facts, its omissions, and its fundamentally self-serving portrayal of a woman who had been one of the most privileged beneficiaries of the Nazi regime. But it was also, in its own way, a document of genuine human feeling, a widow's attempt to make sense of a life that had been defined by love for a man who turned out to be one of history's great criminals. The book sold reasonably well and provided Emmy with a degree of financial security in her final years. Emmy Goering died on June 8, 1973, in Munich, at the age of 80. She had outlived her husband by nearly 27 years and had spent almost all of those years living in the shadow of his legacy. She was buried quietly, and her death attracted some press coverage but relatively little public attention. What she left behind, beyond her memoir and her complicated personal history, was her daughter Edda, who was 35 years old at the time of her mother's death and who was already navigating her own profoundly difficult relationship with the Goering name. Edda Goering had spent the decades since the war's end dealing with the consequences of her birth into one of the most notorious families in modern history. And her story, in many ways, is the most intimate and psychologically complex thread in the entire post-war Goering narrative. Edda Goering was 7 years old when her father committed suicide in his Nuremberg cell, and the world her parents had built around her came apart entirely. She had spent the first 7 years of her life at the very summit of the Third Reich's social world, photographed at state occasions, gifted with masterpieces, and treated as a kind of princess in the regime's attempt to project images of wholesome German family life. Adolf Hitler had been her godfather, attending her baptism and expressing affection for her and her parents on multiple occasions. She had lived at Karinhall surrounded by artworks of staggering value and beauty in rooms where the most powerful figures of Nazi Germany had sat at dinner. And then, practically overnight, all of it was gone. The estate was rubble. The paintings were seized, the jewels were confiscated. Her father was dead. Her mother was a prisoner. The little girl who had been photographed laughing in the grounds of Karinhall found herself in a world that had a very clear and very unfavourable opinion of the family name she carried. The years of Edda's childhood and adolescence in the late 1940s and 1950s were spent in Munich with her mother, and by all accounts, Emmy did her best to provide stability and warmth within the constraints of their dramatically reduced circumstances. Edda received a conventional German education and grew up in a city that was simultaneously rebuilding itself physically and grappling with the psychological weight of its own complicity in the Nazi era. What it was like to be Edda Goering in a Munich classroom in the early 1950s, carrying that specific surname and that specific parentage, is something that only she could fully know, and she chose for most of her adult life not to discuss it publicly. She was by all accounts a private, reserved person, more like her mother in temperament than the bombastic, theatrical father whose personality had dominated everything around him. She never married. She had was not entirely willing to leave Edda, was not entirely willing to leave Edda alone. The most persistent thread connecting her to her father's crimes was the question of the artworks. During the years of her childhood at Karinhall, Edda had received numerous gifts of significant artworks, the most famous of which was the Lucas Cranach, the elder painting of Madonna and Child, a work of genuine historical and artistic importance that had been separated from its rightful owner through Goering's systematic looting of European collections. The German government and various restitution authorities began the process of tracing and returning looted artworks in the years following the war, and many of the pieces that had passed through the Goering collection became the subject of complex and extended legal proceedings. Edda, as the surviving heir, found herself involved in a series of court cases throughout the 1950s and 1960s that contested the ownership of artworks and other property that had been given to her or held in her name. The outcomes of these cases were, for Edda, almost uniformly unfavourable. The German courts consistently ruled against her claims to the artworks, finding that their origins in systematic looting meant that any gifts made to Edda during the Nazi years could not constitute legitimate inheritance. In 1968, a significant cluster of these legal proceedings reached their conclusions, and Edda lost the majority of her claims. The Cranach Madonna and Child painting, among other significant pieces, was determined to be property that must be returned to its legitimate owners or transferred to state custody. The legal defeat was a significant one, stripping Edda of material assets that might have provided genuine financial security and closing the book on one of the most contentious aspects of her inheritance. Edda's relationship with her father's memory was one of the defining questions of her adult life, and the answers she gave on the rare occasions when she was willing to give any were consistent, if not entirely satisfying, to those who sought a more complete accounting. She maintained, in private conversations, that Hermann Göring had been a good father to her, warm and attentive, and deeply loving toward his family. She resisted the full extent of his historical indictment without engaging in the kind of public revisionism that characterized the behavior of someone like Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's daughter, who spent her adult life actively working to rehabilitate the image of one of history's most monstrous mass murderers. Edda did not organize, did not campaign, did not write. She simply lived quietly and, when asked directly, said that she remembered her father as a loving man. It was a position that satisfied almost nobody, but that reflected something real about the particular anguish of being the child of a great criminal, the disjunction between the private man and the public monster that children of such figures invariably report. She broke her long public silence only once in a particularly significant way, agreeing in 1986 to a rare television interview for Swedish television, in which she spoke with evident emotion about both of her parents. She expressed love for her mother and a complicated, persistent affection for her father that she seemed to know was difficult for outsiders to understand. The interview attracted considerable attention in Germany and internationally, less because of its specific revelations than because of what it represented. The daughter of the man who had organized the systematic theft of European art and helped plan aggressive wars, speaking, for the first time in decades, about what it meant to be exactly who she was. Edda Goering lived into old age in her native Munich, maintaining her characteristic quietness until the very end. She died on December 21, 2018, at the age of 80, exactly the same age as her mother had been when she died 45 years earlier. Her death was reported in newspapers and history publications around the world, with most accounts framing it as the end of a chapter in the post-war history of Nazi Germany's most prominent family. She had never married, had no children, and left no memoir or public statement about her father's legacy beyond the handful of private expressions of complicated filial love that had been recorded over the decades. The Göring bloodline, in the direct sense, ended with Edda. But the legacy, the name and its associations, the historical weight of what Hermann Göring had done and what his family had known and benefited from, that did not end with her. It remained in archives, in courtrooms, in restitution files, in the memory of the families whose ancestors had been dispossessed, and in the ongoing work of historians trying to trace the thousands of artworks that still had not found their way back to their rightful owners. The network of personal relationships that sustained and surrounded the Göring family during the Nazi years extended well beyond the immediate household, and tracing what happened to some of those individuals in the post-war period adds important texture to the broader family story. Among the most significant of these peripheral figures were the various aides, adjutants and staff members who had managed the practical operations of Göring's extensive household empire. The management of Karinhall alone required a substantial staff, including not just domestic servants but art handlers, foresters, security personnel, administrative staff, cooks, and the various technical specialists required to maintain what was essentially a small private estate with the operational complexity of a minor government office. Many of these individuals were questioned by Allied investigators after the war. Was sometimes helpful to investigators, sometimes evasive, and occasionally contradictory in ways that reflected the complicated loyalties and self-interests of people who had worked closely with one of the regime's most powerful figures. One of the individuals whose post-war story intersects most directly with the Göring families is that of Walter Andreas Hofer, the art dealer who had served as Göring's primary agent in assembling the collection. Hofer was arrested and interrogated at length by Allied art investigators, providing detailed testimony about the acquisition of specific works and the mechanisms by which Göring had built his collection. His cooperation with investigators, which reflected both genuine pragmatism about his own situation and a certain professional pride in the details of his expertise, made him a valuable source for the reconstruction of the collection's history, even as it also confirmed the extent to which the collection's assembly had involved systematic exploitation of Jewish owners and coercive purchases in occupied territories. Hofer was eventually released without criminal charges being filed against him, a decision that reflected both the practical constraints on prosecutorial resources in the immediate post-war period and the complex question of how to assess the criminal liability of individuals who had facilitated looting through professional expertise rather than direct force. He returned to the art world in a reduced capacity, and his detailed records of the Göring collection's composition and acquisition history remained valuable to researchers and restitution authorities for decades. Emmy Goering's relationship with the German legal and administrative system in the years following the war was not limited to the Denazification proceedings that classified her as a Mitläufer. She was involved in various legal processes related to property claims, pension entitlements, and the ownership of specific personal effects and household goods that she claimed had been wrongfully seized, or were rightfully hers as a widow. These proceedings wound through the German courts at various speeds and with varying outcomes, and they illustrated something important about the way in which the German legal system in the Reconstruction era was forced to balance the demands of restitution and denazification against the practical realities of managing the legal and financial affairs of thousands of individuals connected to the regime. Emmy's widow's pension was a particular point of contention. Under German law, war widows were entitled to pensions from the state. But the question of whether the widow of a convicted war criminal who had been executed following a legitimate international tribunal was entitled to the same consideration as other war widows was one that generated political controversy and legal complexity. Emmy eventually received a pension, but the amount and the conditions attached to it were subjects of extended negotiation and occasional public debate in Germany in the 1950s. The denazification system that processed Emmy Goering's case was itself one of the most complex and ultimately imperfect administrative exercises in post-war German history. The system was established by the Allied occupation authorities and implemented through a network of German-staffed tribunals known as Spruchkammern, which were responsible for assessing the degree of each individual's involvement with and responsibility for the Nazi regime. The 5 categories into which individuals were sorted ranged from major offenders who faced the most severe sanctions through offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and finally exonerated persons who had no meaningful connection to the regime or had actively resisted it. The system processed millions of cases and was almost immediately overwhelmed by the scale of the task, the shortage of qualified personnel, and the enormous political pressures that surrounded individual decisions. Major offenders were relatively rare in the system's final tallies, partly because many who should have been in that category had died or fled before they could be processed, and partly because the tribunals were under pressure from the emerging Cold War context to prioritize economic reconstruction and social stability over thorough accountability. Emmy's classification as a Mitläufer, a follower, placed her in the second lowest category, which was by the late 1940s the most common outcome for individuals who had moved in elite Nazi social circles without holding formal party positions of significant power. It was a classification that many historians of the denazification system have subsequently argued was too mild for someone of her social prominence and the scale of her family's enrichment. Edda Goering's school years in Munich in the late 1940s and early 1950s are barely documented in any surviving sources, which reflects both her exceptional privacy and the general scarcity of detailed records about the private lives of young people in Germany's Reconstruction era. But the experience of being a child with the Göring surname in a Munich classroom during those years can be partially imagined through the broader context of what post-war German childhood was like for the children of the Nazi elite. Germany in 1948 and 1949 was a country in which the conversation about what had happened under National Socialism was simultaneously unavoidable and deeply uncomfortable, present everywhere in the physical ruins of bombed cities and in the psychological scars of military defeat, but often suppressed in formal social and educational contexts where the adults responsible for discussion were themselves deeply compromised by their wartime behavior and allegiances. Schools in the American occupation zone were subject to a denazification of their curricula and teaching staff, with former Nazis removed from teaching positions and new educational materials introduced that attempted to address the history and crimes of the Nazi era. But the practical reality of implementation was uneven, and the emotional climate of German schools in the late 1940s was one of complex tensions between official acknowledgement of Nazi crimes and the private loyalties and denials that many families maintained in their domestic lives. For Edda, this context would have been experienced through the specific lens of having one of the most immediately recognizable surnames in German history. Every teacher, every classmate, every parent of a classmate would have known exactly who she was and what her father had represented. The question of how children in this situation were treated, whether with ostracism, with curious fascination, with misplaced sympathy, or with the particular cruelty that adolescents can direct at those who stand out in any way, is one that the historical record does not answer in Edda's specific case. What is known is that she managed to complete her education and establish herself in adult life without apparent lasting crisis, which suggests either remarkable personal resilience, the protective care of her mother, or simply the power of time and privacy to create space around even the most exposed personal histories. The question of what it meant to be the goddaughter of Adolf Hitler is one that Edda Goering navigated in her own particular way, but it was also a question that applied, with varying degrees of intensity, to a small number of other individuals who had received this particular distinction during the Nazi years. Hitler served as godfather to several children of his inner circle, a practice that reflected both the quasi-religious dimension of the cult of personality that surrounded him and the practical social bonds that tied the senior Nazi leadership into a network of mutual obligation and personal connection. The children who received this particular distinction found themselves, after the war, carrying not just the surname of their parents, but an additional marker of proximity to the regime's absolute centre. For Edda, the fact of Hitler's godparenthood was a piece of her biography that she neither publicly affirmed nor publicly denied, leaving it to be confirmed or discussed by others without adding her own voice to the record. It was one of several biographical facts about her childhood that she essentially refused to engage with on the terms that journalists, historians, and documentary makers repeatedly offered her. Her silence on this subject, as on so many others, was not ignorance, but choice. The broader social world of senior Nazi wives and their post-war lives has been the subject of increasing historical scholarship since the 1990s, and Emmy Goering features as one of the central figures in this literature. Works by historians including Guido Knopp, Anna Maria Sigmund, and others have examined the specific social roles that women like Emmy played in the Nazi hierarchy and the varying ways in which they navigated the post-war period. Emmy's case is particularly interesting to these scholars partly because of her theatrical background, which gives her pre-Nazi social trajectory a texture different from the more purely domestic or ideological backgrounds of some other senior wives, and partly because of the memoir she published, which provides an unusually detailed if unreliable first-person account of life at the summit of the Third Reich's social world. The scholarly treatment of Emmy has generally been more critical than sympathetic, emphasizing her willing participation in the social fabric of the regime and her post-war refusal to engage honestly with the full implications of her family's role. But the scholarship also acknowledges the genuine complexity of her situation and the limitations, that gender roles, social position, and the psychological mechanisms of love and loyalty placed on what she could realistically be expected to understand and acknowledge. Of all the members of the Göring family whose lives were shaped and reshaped by the Second World War and its aftermath, none presents a more striking, more morally interesting, or more ultimately tragic story than that of Albert Göring, Herman's younger brother. Albert's story is, in many ways, the story of a man who spent the entire war doing everything his famous brother was not doing, using the Göring name not as a tool of power and plunder, but as a shield behind which he could protect the vulnerable, rescue the condemned, and defy a regime that his brother had helped build. And yet, after the war, the very name that had enabled Albert's quiet acts of resistance became the thing that destroyed his ability to live a normal life. It is one of the darkest ironies in the entire post-war history of Nazi Germany, and it deserves to be told in full. Albert Göring was born on March 9, 1895, in Rosenheim, Bavaria, 2 years after his famous older brother. The two boys grew up in the same household, received similar educations, and were formed by the same combination of military tradition, middle-class aspiration, and the cultural upheavals of Wilhelmina Germany. But where Herman grew into a man of outsized appetites and boundless ambition, a man who craved admiration, power, and the validation of great men, Albert developed in almost exactly the opposite direction. He was described by those who knew him as quiet, artistic, and fundamentally decent. A man who found the noise and theatricality of politics distasteful and who had no interest in the kind of hierarchical chest-beating that consumed his brother's world. Albert went into engineering and business, building a career in the film and manufacturing industries, and it was this career path that would take him to exactly the parts of Central and Eastern Europe where the Nazi regime's crimes were most visible and most visceral. In the 1930s, Albert Göring was working in Austria and then in Czechoslovakia, where he eventually obtained a senior position at the Skoda Works, the enormous armaments and manufacturing company based in Plzeň. His position at Skoda placed him at the heart of the Nazi occupation's economic exploitation of conquered territory, but Albert used his presence there in ways that were fundamentally at odds with the regime's goals. He was not a member of the Nazi Party and never became one, a fact that was remarkable in itself given the professional and social pressure that bore on almost everyone in occupied Europe to demonstrate at least formal loyalty to the German overlords. He refused to give the Nazi salute. He made no secret of his contempt for the regime's racial ideology. And he began, carefully and systematically, to use whatever leverage his position and his surname provided to protect people who were at risk. The mechanics of Albert Göring's resistance were varied and inventive. He falsified export documents to help people escape from occupied territories. He used his business connections to provide cover stories and false identities. He arranged for the release of prisoners who had been detained by the Gestapo, sometimes by placing phone calls in which he allowed his famous surname to do the work, sometimes by formally requesting releases through official channels, and sometimes by more inventive means. On at least one documented occasion, he drove past a group of Jewish women who were being forced to scrub a Vienna street under SS supervision, stopped his car, walked over, and knelt down alongside them and began scrubbing himself until the humiliated SS guards, unwilling to force a Göring to his knees in public, ordered the entire detail released. It was the kind of act that required both moral courage and a certain theatrical boldness, and Albert seems to have possessed both in abundance. On multiple occasions he was arrested by the Gestapo for his activities, and on multiple occasions he was released after his brother Herman intervened. Their relationship was complicated and occasionally strained, but Herman, whatever his many monstrous qualities, seems to have retained enough family loyalty to use his power to protect his younger brother from the most serious consequences of his resistance activities. Albert, for his part, later described Hermann's interventions with a mixture of gratitude for the practical result and profound discomfort at what the instrument of his rescue represented. The list of people Albert Göring helped is remarkable in its length and diversity. He assisted the widow of composer Franz Lehár, who was Jewish, in obtaining the legal protections that preserved her from persecution. He helped the conductor Arturo Toscanini, who was attempting to maintain his connection to European musical life despite the political pressures bearing on him. He forged Herman's signature on documents authorizing the release of political prisoners from concentration camps, a tactic that was breathtakingly dangerous and that succeeded at least partly because the SS guards receiving the documents were sufficiently intimidated by the Göring name to comply without double-checking their authenticity. He provided financial support to resistance organizations operating in Czechoslovakia and helped several prominent Czech resistance figures escape arrest or obtain false documentation. Various estimates of the number of people Albert Göring directly helped escape death or persecution during the Nazi years range from dozens to over 100, with the precise figure impossible to establish definitively given the clandestine nature of many of his activities. What happened to Albert Göring when the war ended? Given his extraordinary record of resistance, you might expect that he would have emerged from the collapse of the Third Reich with his reputation intact, perhaps even enhanced by the testimony of those he had helped. Instead, Albert Göring found himself in a situation that combined tragedy, absurdity, and profound injustice in equal measure. When American forces occupied his area of operations in 1945, Albert was arrested on the basis of his surname alone. He was Hermann Göring's brother. He had worked at a major armaments facility. He had lived and operated in Nazi-occupied territory for years. From the perspective of an Allied soldier following standard procedures, all of this made him a legitimate subject of interrogation and potential prosecution. Albert was taken into custody and held for an extended period while his case was investigated. He cooperated fully with his interrogators, providing them with a comprehensive account of everything he had done during the war years and a list of the people he had helped. The problem was that verifying his account took time, and during that time he remained imprisoned, his case complicated by the overwhelming association of his name with one of history's most notorious criminals. The testimony of the people Albert had helped was eventually gathered and presented to the Allied authorities. Franz Lehár's widow wrote a letter of support. Czech officials provided documentation of his resistance activities. Former prisoners and refugees whom he had helped came forward with their accounts. The accumulating evidence was compelling, and by 1946 the Allied authorities had concluded that Albert Göring was not a war criminal and had no case to answer. He was released. But release from Allied custody was only the beginning of Albert's problems, because he then had to return to civilian life in post-war Germany as the brother of the most famous convicted Nazi war criminal in history. And that surname followed him everywhere and destroyed almost every professional opportunity he attempted to pursue. Employers were unwilling to hire him. Business partners were reluctant to associate themselves with anyone bearing the Göring name. Even personal and social relationships were complicated by the constant presence of his brother's shadow. Albert attempted to establish himself in various business ventures in post-war Germany and Switzerland, but the combination of the name, the times, and the difficult economic circumstances of the Reconstruction era made sustained professional success essentially impossible. He married and he had a daughter named Elizabeth, but his personal life was also marked by significant difficulty and instability. He struggled financially throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, and there were periods during which he was in serious hardship. Attempts were made to have Albert's name placed on formal lists of resistance figures and anti-Nazi activists, which would have provided both official recognition and a degree of practical benefit in the post-war German administrative system. These efforts met with mixed success. German authorities were cautious about formally celebrating the resistance record of someone who shared a surname with Hermann Göring, and the bureaucratic processes that governed such designations were slow and inconsistent. Albert had to repeatedly tell his story to different officials and different committees, each time producing his list of names and his account of specific interventions, each time waiting while the wheels of bureaucratic process turned. The recognition he deserved was delayed, reduced, and ultimately inadequate to the practical reality of his situation. Albert Göring died on December 20th, 1966, in Munich, at the age of 71. He died in relative poverty and obscurity, his extraordinary record of resistance still known to a relatively small number of historians and virtually unknown to the general public. He had spent the 2 decades following the war's end being penalized for a name he had not chosen and being unable to fully claim the credit for actions that had saved real lives. The injustice of his situation was not lost on those who knew his story, but it took many more decades before his reputation began to receive the rehabilitation it deserved. In the years after his death, as historians of the Nazi era began to investigate the stories of people who had resisted from within occupied territories, Albert Göring's story attracted increasing attention. Books were written about him. Documentaries were produced. The specific incidents of his interventions were traced and verified. Former resistors in the Czech Republic and Austria spoke about what he had done. A German author named William Hastings Burke wrote a biography that did significant work in bringing Albert's story to a wider audience, and the response to that biography was, in many quarters, one of genuine astonishment that this particular story was not already widely known. There have been campaigns primarily driven by historians and documentary filmmakers to have Albert Göring recognized by Yad Vashem, the Israeli institution responsible for maintaining the world's most comprehensive archive of Holocaust history and recognizing those who risked their lives to save Jewish people. The designation of righteous among the nations awarded by Yad Vashem to non-Jews who risked their lives to help Jewish people during the Holocaust is among the highest moral distinctions available in the post-war world. The case for Albert Göring's inclusion has been made repeatedly and with considerable supporting documentation. The challenges have revolved around questions of verification for some of the less well-documented incidents. The complicated question of how much of what he did was genuinely selfless resistance versus practical helpfulness that happened to benefit people who were Jewish, and the institutional difficulty of formally honoring someone who bears one of the most infamous surnames in German history. As of the time of this video's production, the formal recognition had not been fully granted, but the campaign continues and the historical record continues to accumulate evidence of what Albert Göring did and why it mattered. The contrast between the two Göring brothers is one of those genuine historical paradoxes that resist easy explanation. They grew up in the same house, received the same education, carried the same blood and the same name. One became the most powerful and most criminally culpable member of the Nazi hierarchy after Hitler himself, a man who oversaw the systematic looting of an entire continent and who helped plan wars that killed tens of millions of people. The other used that very name as a tool of rescue, forging documents in the name of power to undermine power itself, kneeling in the street to confront humiliation, and risking his life repeatedly to protect people who his brother's regime was trying to destroy. The question of what produces such dramatically different moral responses to the same historical circumstances in members of the same family is one that historians and psychologists continue to examine. There are no simple answers. What is clear is that Albert Göring's story represents one of the most genuinely extraordinary personal histories to emerge from the Second World War, and that the post-war treatment of that story, the imprisonment, the professional destruction, the delayed recognition, is itself a moral failure of the occupation and reconstruction period that deserves to be acknowledged. The Göring family extended well beyond Herman, Carin, Emmy, Edda, and Albert, and tracing the experiences of the wider family circle in the post-war years reveals additional layers of complexity and variety. Hermann Göring had been the fifth of 6 children born to his parents, Heinrich Ernst Göring and Franziska Tiefenbrunn, and several of his siblings lived through the war and its aftermath. The oldest siblings included Fanny, Karl Ernst, Olga, and Paula, as well as the younger Albert. The family patriarch, Heinrich Ernst Göring, had died in 1913, long before any of his children achieved historical significance, and Franziska had died in 1923, the year Herman married Carin, so neither parent lived to see what their most famous son became. The siblings who survived into the Nazi era occupied varying positions relative to their famous brother's power and influence. Some maintained closer connections to Herman's world, attending family occasions and accepting the reflected prestige and material benefits that proximity to his position provided. Others maintained more distance, living lives that were less entangled with the regime's activities, and therefore somewhat easier to disentangle in the post-war reckoning. Karl Ernst Göring, one of Hermann's older brothers, had a career as a forester and maintained a relatively conventional professional life, benefiting from the family connection but not occupying any position of particular power or prominence within the Nazi apparatus. After the war, Karl Ernst had to navigate the denazification proceedings that applied to virtually anyone with a meaningful connection to the Nazi era, and the Göring surname created complications and heightened scrutiny, but he was not accused of specific crimes and managed to establish a reasonably stable post-war existence. He died in relative obscurity, his story largely unrecorded beyond the bare biographical facts preserved in historical registries. Olga Göring, another sibling, followed a similarly quiet trajectory, marrying and building a life that was defined more by the provincial German social world she moved in than by any particular engagement with her famous brother's political career. The post-war period required her, as it required all members of the family, to manage the association with a name that had become synonymous with some of the worst crimes in human history, but without the extraordinary complications that attached to Albert's case or the very public visibility that attached to Emmy and Edda. Olga was able to live in considerably more privacy. Paula Göring, the youngest of the siblings, had the perhaps peculiar distinction of navigating the post-war world in the same position as another famous surname bearer of the Nazi era. She was a sibling of a senior Nazi figure, largely uninvolved in the regime's activities, required to process the collapse of the family's social world while maintaining some claim to her own independent identity. The broader phenomenon of Nazi family members attempting to establish their own individual accountability, to separate themselves from the crimes of the specific relatives who had held power, is one of the more psychologically complex aspects of the post-war German experience, and the Göring siblings represent one strand of that phenomenon. The surname that their brother had made infamous was an inheritance none of them could escape, and the question of what to do with it, whether to confront it publicly, to retreat from it into silence, or to continue bearing it as neutrally as possible while building lives that bore no relationship to its associations, was one that each of them had to answer in their own way. Hermann Göring had also developed, during his years in power, an extensive network of professional and personal associates, aides, adjutants, and subordinates, who had become closely connected to the family's social world, and the fate of those connections after the war illustrates something important about the transactional nature of the relationships that sustained the Nazi elite. Many, who had been effusive in their affection and loyalty during the years of power, proved considerably cooler when the power was gone. Emmy had noted this phenomenon in her later writings, the way in which social relationships that had seemed solid and genuine had evaporated with remarkable speed once it became clear that their was no longer anything to be gained from association with the Göring name. A handful of genuinely loyal friends maintained their connections and provided practical assistance during the difficult years of the late 1940s and early 1950s. And these individuals figured in Emmy's memoirs as representatives of human decency in a landscape otherwise stripped of it. The Karinhall estate, that monument to Hermann Göring's grief, his grandiosity, and his criminal accumulation of beauty, continued to have a complex afterlife even after its physical destruction in April 1945. The ruins in the Schorfheide forest became, in the decades following the war, a subject of historical curiosity and occasional archaeological investigation. The East German state, which controlled the territory after the division of Germany, was notably uninterested in preserving or commemorating any aspect of the site's connection to a senior Nazi official, and the forest was allowed to reclaim the ruins at its own pace. After German reunification in 1990, some efforts were made to investigate the site archaeologically and to establish the full extent of what Göring had built there. Underground structures, bunker systems, and the foundations of various buildings were mapped and catalogued. Artifacts associated with the estate were occasionally uncovered, and these finds attracted historical and media attention. The site is today marked but not elaborately signposted, accessible to those who seek it out but not promoted as a tourist attraction. The gravesite of Carin, the original mausoleum, is partially visible as a foundation in the forest floor, stripped of its decorative elements and occupant, returned to earth like everything else Göring built. The artworks that passed through Göring's hands represented perhaps the most concrete and enduring material legacy of his years of criminal accumulation, and the process of tracing, recovering and returning those works to their rightful owners has continued for decades beyond the war's end and is in many cases still ongoing. Göring's art collection was one of the largest assembled by any individual during the Second World War, comprising thousands of individual works spanning paintings, sculptures, tapestries, decorative objects, and antiquities sourced from across occupied Europe. He maintained a meticulous inventory and had a genuine, if acquisitive, aesthetic sensibility that led him to prefer certain schools and certain periods. The Cranach Madonna given to baby Edda was one item among thousands, and when the systematic restitution process began in the post-war years, the task of untangling the provenance of each piece was enormously complex. Some works had passed through multiple hands before reaching Göring. Some had been purchased under coercive conditions that technically resembled legal transactions, but were in fact forced sales at controlled prices from which their Jewish owners could not practically refuse. Some had been outright seized. Some had been stolen from state collections in occupied countries. The distinction between these categories mattered for legal purposes, but did not change the fundamental fact that Göring's collection was built on the dispossession of those the regime had stripped of their rights and their property. The specific incidents in which Albert Goering intervened to help people at risk from the Nazi regime are documented in varying degrees of detail, and the cumulative picture that emerges from the verified accounts is one of a man who made a consistent and deliberate series of choices over an extended period, not spontaneous acts of isolated compassion, but a sustained pattern of resistance that reflected a fundamental rejection of what the regime represented. Among the most well-documented of Albert's interventions was his involvement in securing the release of a group of inmates from the Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, which he accomplished by arranging for a truckload of prisoners to be transferred to a work detail and then simply not returning them to the camp. The precise mechanisms of this operation and the identities of those involved in facilitating it have been examined by researchers who have attempted to verify and document Albert's resistance record, and the core of the account appears to be supported by multiple independent sources. Other documented interventions include his use of forged signatures on letters and orders that purported to authorize the release of individuals held by the Gestapo, his provision of false employment documentation to people who needed cover stories for their activities or identities, and his direct physical interventions like the famous street scrubbing incident in Vienna, in which he used his personal presence and the power of his surname to directly challenge specific acts of humiliation and persecution. What motivated Albert Göring to take these risks is a question that his post-war statements addressed only partially and somewhat obliquely. He seems to have been a man of genuine moral sensibility who found the Nazi racial ideology intellectually absurd and morally repugnant, and whose reaction to the persecution of Jewish people and political opponents was one of instinctive resistance rather than calculated strategy. He was not an organized political resistor in the manner of the members of the various German resistance groups that operated through the war years. He did not communicate with Allied intelligence services, did not participate in assassination plots against Hitler, and did not coordinate with larger resistance networks. His activities were individual and largely improvised, driven by specific opportunities to help specific people rather than by a systematic plan. This improvised individual quality to his resistance is actually one of the things that makes his story particularly interesting to historians of the Nazi period, because it suggests that the space for individual moral choice within the Nazi system was larger than the systemic determinism of some historical accounts implies, that an individual with courage, connections, and a willingness to use both could make real differences in specific people's lives, even within the most murderous regime in modern history. The role of the Skoda works in Albert Goering's story deserves specific attention because the company he worked for was itself deeply embedded in the Nazi war economy and in the exploitation of occupied Czechoslovakia's industrial resources. The Skoda works in Plzeň was one of the largest arms manufacturers in Europe, producing tanks, artillery, and other military equipment for the German war machine throughout the occupation period. Its workers included a significant proportion of forced labourers, people compelled to work in the factory under conditions that were often brutal and that constituted a form of slavery directly analogous to the conditions prevailing in the concentration camp system. Albert Göring's position at Skoda placed him in daily proximity to this exploitation, and the question of what he did about it beyond the individual interventions he is documented as having made is one that historians have examined with some care. The picture that emerges is of a man who used his position to moderate specific abuses, where he had the practical ability to do so, who resisted participation in the most egregious forms of exploitation, but who also continued to work within a system that was fundamentally criminal in its treatment of its workforce. This is not an unusual profile for someone who resisted within the Nazi system. The available space for resistance was always partial, always compromised by the broader structures within which any individual operated, and the choice was rarely between perfect integrity and complicity, but rather between varying degrees of both. The post-war Czech government's treatment of Albert Göring is another thread in the story that illustrates the complexity of his position. Czechoslovakia had been among the countries most severely affected by German occupation, and the Czech national experience of the Nazi years generated strong emotions and strong political pressures in the immediate post-war period. When Albert was first detained by the Allies and his case was being investigated, Czech officials played an important role in the process, both because of the crimes committed in Czechoslovakia during the occupation and because Albert had lived and worked there throughout the war years. Czech witnesses who came forward to testify to Albert's interventions and resistance activities were crucial to the eventual determination that he should be released, and the Czech government's handling of his case reflected the tension between the national impulse to hold all Germans associated with the occupation responsible and the specific evidence that Albert's case presented. The eventual resolution in which Albert was cleared and released represented a genuine act of official acknowledgement of what he had done, even if that acknowledgement was not translated into the broader recognition and rehabilitation that his record deserved. One of the most poignant aspects of Albert Göring's post-war story is the isolation he experienced not just from professional opportunities but from the family connections that might have provided some degree of personal support. Herman was dead, Emmy was wrapped in her own grief and her own legal difficulties, and was, by temperament and circumstance, not inclined to embrace the brother whose existence implicitly challenged her version of her husband's character. Edda was a child, and then a young woman whose own life was difficult enough without the additional complexity of maintaining a close relationship with an uncle whose story raised questions she preferred not to engage with. Albert's marriage and the birth of his daughter Elizabeth provided some personal anchor, but the professional and social isolation of the 1950s and early 1960s was genuine and grinding, and it took a toll on him that those who knew him in those years described with evident sympathy. He died in Munich in December 1966, just before his 72nd birthday, without the recognition that his wartime actions deserved, and without the material security that any professional in a comparable position might have expected after a working life of his length and scope. His daughter Elizabeth was the primary surviving connection to his story, and she played a role in some of the later efforts to document and recognise her father's resistance record. The broader phenomenon of Germans who used their social or professional positions within the Nazi system to protect people at risk has been documented in increasing detail by historians since the 1970s, and Albert Göring figures in this literature as one of the more dramatic and well-documented examples. The historical category of Helfer and Retter, helpers and rescuers, within Nazi Germany and occupied Europe encompasses an extraordinarily diverse group of individuals who resisted in varying ways and to varying extents, from those who provided a single act of assistance to those who made it the project of years. Albert's case is notable partly for the sheer duration and number of his interventions, and partly for the extraordinary asymmetry between the resources he could theoretically have deployed as the brother of one of the regime's most powerful figures, had he chosen to use his position for self-advancement, and the use to which he actually put those resources. He could have been extraordinarily wealthy, well-connected and comfortable. He chose to be a forger, a rescuer, and a quiet subverter of the system his brother was helping to run. The moral clarity of that choice, made over and over again across the years of the occupation, stands in permanent contrast to everything the Göring name had come to represent in the wider world. The question of whether Hermann Göring knew the full extent of his brother's resistance activities is one that historians have examined without reaching a definitive conclusion. The interactions between the two brothers during the war years were limited and mediated by the extraordinary difference in their positions, one at the apex of the regime's power structure and the other working in occupied Czechoslovakia as a manager in an industrial company. Hermann's interventions to protect Albert from Gestapo arrest on multiple occasions demonstrate that he was aware Albert was doing things the regime disapproved of, and that he was willing to use his authority to shield his brother from the consequences. Whether he knew the full scope of what Albert was doing, the forged documents, the organised escapes, the systematic protection of Jewish people and political opponents, is a different question. Albert later suggested that Hermann had been generally aware of his activities and had chosen not to know the details, a formulation that was convenient for both brothers in their different ways, but that probably contains a significant degree of truth. Hermann Göring had enough political enemies and enough of his own legal problems without inviting additional scrutiny to his family, and a posture of deliberate ignorance about Albert's specific activities would have been consistent with both his family loyalty and his practical self-interest. The ruins of Karinhall in the Schorfheide forest have attracted various forms of attention in the decades since the war's end, and the efforts to investigate and document what remains of the site illuminate something interesting about Germany's relationship with its most uncomfortable architectural heritage. East Germany, which controlled the Schorfheide region from 1949 until reunification in 1990, officially designated the area as a protected nature reserve and hunting ground, a designation that served the practical purpose of maintaining the land's productive use while effectively suppressing any public engagement with its historical significance. Senior East German leaders, including Erich Honecker, used the Schorfheide as a hunting ground, an irony that was not lost on commentators, who noted the continuity between Hermann Göring's use of the area as his private preserve and the appropriation of the same landscape by the leaders of the ostensibly anti-fascist German Democratic Republic. After reunification, the historical significance of the site became more openly acknowledged, and various efforts to document, investigate, and interpret the ruins were undertaken by historians, archaeologists, and heritage professionals. What these investigations revealed was both extensive and sobering. The scale of what Göring had built there was larger than many had realized, with underground bunker systems, service buildings, and infrastructure stretching across a considerable area of the forest, and the process of nature reclaiming it was slow enough that substantial physical evidence remained available for study. The process of tracing and returning artworks associated with the Göring collection has, in the decades since the war's end, produced some extraordinary stories of discovery, negotiation, and restitution that illustrate both the progress that has been made and the enormous distance that remains to be covered. One of the most significant developments in the long effort to trace Göring's looted art came with the establishment of digital databases in the 1990s and 2000s that made it possible for researchers, heirs, and institutions to cross-reference records in ways that had been practically impossible in the earlier decades. The German Lost Art Foundation, the Art Loss Register, and various national restitution databases established across Europe have collectively made the process of identifying specific works and matching them to historical records significantly more efficient than the manual archive searches that characterized the first decades of post-war investigation. These technological advances have contributed to a significant acceleration in the pace of restitution decisions in the late 1990s and 2000s, with numerous works associated with the Göring collection identified and returned to descendants of their original owners through a combination of negotiated agreements and formal legal proceedings. Among the cases that attracted particular public attention in the broader context of Nazi-era looting, several have involved specific works that can be traced directly or indirectly to the Göring collection. The recovery processes have sometimes been straightforward, with clear documentary evidence connecting a specific work to its pre-war owner and its subsequent acquisition by Göring, enabling a relatively direct path to restitution. Other cases have been enormously complicated by the number of hands through which works passed after leaving Göring's possession in the chaos of the war's final months, the destruction of relevant records, and the good faith acquisition of works by post-war buyers who had no way of knowing their histories. The legal and ethical frameworks for addressing these complicated cases have evolved considerably over the decades, with the 1998 Washington Principles providing important guidance and the subsequent Vilnius Forum and Terezin Declaration adding further commitments from signatory nations. The practical implementation of these frameworks has been uneven, with some countries and institutions performing substantially better than others in conducting thorough provenance reviews and acting promptly on identified claims. The specific case of the Cranach Madonna that was given to Edda Goering as a child gift illustrates many of these complexities in miniature. The painting's pre-war history, its removal from its original owner's possession, its transit through Göring's collection, its presentation to Edda as a childhood gift, the legal proceedings of the 1950s and 1960s that ultimately removed it from Edda's possession, and its eventual institutional fate have been traced by art historians working on Nazi-era provenance research. The case demonstrates how a single work of art can accumulate a history of ownership, displacement, legal contestation, and eventual resolution that spans multiple generations and multiple countries, involving legal systems, governmental restitution programs, and the direct human experience of people on several sides of the original dispossession. The painting's current location and ownership, following the legal proceedings of the late 1960s, have been the subject of continuing attention from researchers focused on the Cranach's specific history and on the broader question of what happened to works associated with the Göring collection after they left the family's direct possession. Emmy Goering's memoir, An der Seite meines Mannes, occupies an interesting place in the library of memoirs and personal accounts written by the wives and associates of senior Nazi figures. It is not the most self-serving of these accounts, which distinction probably belongs to the various efforts by former SS wives and party officials' partners to portray themselves as entirely uninvolved in the regime's activities. But it is also not the most honest, which distinction belongs to the handful of accounts written by people who had the courage to engage seriously with their own complicity and its consequences. Emmy's memoir falls in a middle zone that reflects the particular combination of genuine love, persistent loyalty, and carefully maintained self-deception that characterized her relationship with her husband's memory. She writes about him with evident warmth and occasional genuine insight into his personality. She describes specific incidents from their life together that give the book texture and authenticity as a personal document. But she consistently fails to engage with the fundamental questions that the regime's crimes raise about her own role, her own knowledge, and her own responsibility, and this failure is consistent enough and thoroughgoing enough to suggest that it was not accidental but deliberate. She knew what she was not saying, and she chose not to say it. The question of Emmy's knowledge of the Holocaust is one that her memoir does not seriously address, and it is one that historians have examined with considerable care in the broader context of what the senior wives of Nazi leaders knew and when they knew it. The evidence suggests that Emmy was not specifically briefed on the mechanics of the extermination program in the way that some senior officials were, but that she was thoroughly enmeshed in the social world of people who knew and who showed every sign of that knowledge in ways that were readable to careful observers. The dinner parties at Karinhall included individuals who were directly involved in the planning and implementation of the Holocaust. The social events she organised and attended were populated by people who had ordered mass murders and who discussed their work with varying degrees of frankness in social settings. Whether Emmy ever heard something explicit enough to penetrate her remarkable capacity for self-protective inattention is something that neither she nor the historical record is able to answer definitively. What the evidence does establish is that she was not a passive housewife, ignorant of the world around her, but an engaged and active participant in the social world of the regime's elite, and that the information available in that world to anyone paying attention was sufficient to support a clear understanding of what the regime was doing and why. Edda Goering's death in December 2018 prompted a wave of retrospective coverage in German and international media that approached her life from a variety of angles and with varying degrees of sympathy and critical distance. German newspaper obituaries tended to be factual and measured, noting her privacy, her reticence about her father's legacy, and her long legal battles over artworks, while also acknowledging the genuine difficulty of her position as the child of one of history's most prominent criminals. International coverage was similarly divided between sympathy for the human complexity of her situation and clear-eyed acknowledgement of what her father had done, and what her family's lifestyle during the Nazi years had been built upon. Several obituaries noted the significance of her death as the end of the direct Göring bloodline, the last living person who had known Hermann Göring as a parent and who carried the family's history in the most personal way. There were no reports of any final public statement, no deathbed confessions or revelations, no letters to be opened or memoirs to be published posthumously. She died as she had lived, quietly and without public gesture, leaving the historical record to speak for itself. The German concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the coming to terms with the past, is one that has been applied with particular intensity to the Nazi era and its consequences, and the Göring family's post-war story provides a set of case studies in the different ways that this process can unfold, be refused, be complicated, or be perverted. Emmy's memoir represents a partial and flawed engagement with the past that ultimately fails to achieve genuine reckoning because it is too protective of its subject. Edda's silence represents a refusal of the public dimension of the process, an insistence on the private over the historical that preserves personal peace at the cost of historical contribution. Albert's post-war experience represents, in a deeply ironic way, a form of Vergangenheitsbewältigung that was imposed on him rather than chosen, as he was forced to reckon with a surname and a family history that he had spent the war years actively trying to undermine, and to do so in conditions of material hardship and professional exclusion that made the reckoning a punishment rather than a liberation. The various official processes of denazification, restitution, and legal reckoning that applied to the Göring family's material legacy represent the institutional dimension of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, imperfect and incomplete, but real in their effects and important in their insistence that crimes have consequences, even when the principal perpetrators have managed to escape them through death. The Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, where Karinhall once stood, is today part of a UNESCO biosphere reserve. A protected landscape valued for its ecological significance, its forests of pine and birch, its lakes and rivers, and the extraordinary variety of wildlife it supports. Visitors to the area today would find little to indicate the presence of what was once the grandest private estate of the Third Reich's most flamboyant leader. The forest has done what forests do. It has grown, shed its leaves, grown again, fallen in storms, and grown once more over the decades since the explosions of April 1945 reduced Karinhall to rubble. What remains of the physical structure is modest and requires deliberate effort to find: some foundation walls, the outline of the mausoleum where Karin's bones once rested, pieces of underground infrastructure that speak to the scale of what was built. The German state of Brandenburg has made some efforts to document and contextualize these remains, but it has deliberately refrained from creating anything that might function as a monument or memorial to Göring himself. The ruins exist in a historical limbo, acknowledged but not celebrated, preserved by the forest's indifference rather than any deliberate human decision. It is a fitting disposition for the physical remains of a monument that was always as much about ego and excess as about the grief it claimed to honour. The Fock family in Sweden, the relatives of Hermann Göring's birth family, largely maintained their distance from the Göring saga after the war, and their experience represents an interesting peripheral thread in the family's broader post-war story. Karin's Swedish relatives had watched her transformation from a Swedish aristocrat into the wife of one of Germany's most powerful and most criminal officials, had seen her name attached to a monument of Nazi excess, and had eventually facilitated the return of her remains to Swedish soil after the war's end. Their own lives, conducted in a country that had maintained its neutrality throughout the conflict and that had its own complicated relationship with the Nazi regime's demands during the war years, were not directly affected by the legal and social consequences that applied to the German members of the Göring circle, but the association with the Göring name, through the family connection to Carin, was something that the Fock family would have had to navigate in the specific social context of Swedish society in the post-war decades, a society that was also undergoing its own process of reckoning with the compromises it had made during the war years, including the transportation of German troops across Swedish territory and the accommodation of various German economic demands. The return of Karin's remains to Sweden was in part a reclamation of her as a Swedish person, rather than a symbol of German power, and the Fock family's role in that reclamation represented a quiet act of historical housekeeping that restored something like appropriate order to the geography of memory. Thomas von Kansow, Karin's son from her first marriage, who had been separated from his mother as a young child, and who had grown up in Sweden while she built her life with Göring, lived out his adult years in a Sweden that was processing its own war experience. Working in various capacities and maintaining the low profile that had characterized his relationship to the Göring story throughout. His connection to the Göring family was through his mother, not through any adoption or formal legal relationship with Herman, and the question of his emotional and psychological relationship to the name his mother had taken when she married is one that the historical record does not address in detail. What is known is that he maintained enough connection to the memory of his mother to be involved in discussions about her remains and their eventual resting place, and that he lived his life in Sweden without seeking any particular engagement with the German side of his family's complicated history. His story is a reminder that the Göring family's post-war experience extended into unexpected corners, affecting people who had been peripheral to its central drama, but who carried its connections nonetheless. The broader question of what happens to the children and families of those who commit great crimes is one that psychology and social science have examined with increasing sophistication in recent decades, and the Göring family provides one of the most thoroughly documented case studies available. The research literature on what is sometimes called the second generation and third generation of perpetrator families suggests that the inheritance of a criminal legacy has real and measurable effects on descendants, including elevated rates of psychological difficulty, complicated relationships with identity and history, and specific challenges around the integration of public and private narratives about family history. Edda Goering's life, while not extensively documented in clinical terms, fits the broad patterns that this research identifies. Her reticence, her isolation, her refusal to engage publicly with the central facts of her family history, and her maintenance of a private narrative about her father that diverged dramatically from the historical record are all consistent with the psychological patterns that researchers have found in comparable cases. The specific combination of genuine early love for a parent and adult awareness of that parent's historical monstrousness creates a psychological dilemma that has no clean resolution, and the various ways in which children of great criminals have attempted to resolve it, from Niklas Frank's public denunciation to Gudrun Himmler's active defense to Edda Goering's principled silence, represent different attempts to manage what is ultimately an unmanageable inheritance. The men and women responsible for identifying, cataloguing and returning Göring's stolen artworks worked through a range of institutions established by the Allied powers immediately after the war, including the Art Looting Investigation Unit of the United States Army, the various collecting points established in Germany to receive and hold recovered artworks, and the Restitution, commissions established by individual European governments. The scale of the task was almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands of individual works had been looted across Europe during the Nazi years, and Göring had personally accounted for a significant percentage of the most valuable. Major pieces from his collection found their way to the central collecting points at Munich and Wiesbaden, where they were assessed, catalogued, and eventually returned to their countries of origin or to the direct descendants of their original owners where these could be identified. But many pieces disappeared in the chaos of the war's final months, loaded onto trains and trucks that were bombed, ambushed, hidden by various parties, or simply lost in the administrative disorder of an entire continent in simultaneous upheaval. Decades after the war, artworks associated with the Göring collection were still occasionally surfacing in private collections, auction houses, and the inventories of museums whose provenance records had been less carefully maintained than they should have been. The broader question of Göring's financial empire beyond the artworks was similarly complex and similarly productive of extended post-war legal proceedings. During his years of power, Göring had accumulated enormous financial assets through a combination of corruption, extortion, and the various mechanisms by which senior Nazi officials helped themselves to the resources of the state and of the people the state had stripped of their legal rights. He had received enormous payments, bribes effectively, from German industrialists eager to secure his goodwill and his contracts. He had used his position as head of the 4-year plan, the Nazi economic program, to direct state resources in ways that benefited himself and his associates. He had accepted gifts of property, money, and assets from a range of individuals and institutions who had reason to keep him happy. All of this accumulated, wealth was, in theory, subject to seizure and recovery by the post-war German state and by the Allied occupation authorities. The practical reality of recovering it was, however, considerably more difficult, and much of it had been effectively dispersed, hidden, or transferred through unofficial channels in the final chaotic months of the war. Emmy's financial situation in the post-war years reflected this reality. The vast paper wealth of the Göring household had evaporated, and what little could be practically recovered was subject to various competing legal claims. One of the more extraordinary aspects of the Göring family story in the post-war decades is the question of how the family's various members related to each other, and specifically how Emmy and Edda related to Albert, whose record of wartime resistance was so dramatically at odds with everything Herman had represented. The available evidence suggests that the relationship between Emmy and Albert was cool at best, and that they maintained significant personal distance in the years following the war. Emmy's loyalty to her husband's memory was unconditional, and Albert's presence was an implicit challenge to the version of Hermann Göring that Emmy had constructed in her mind and would later articulate in her memoir. Albert, for his part, had complex feelings about his brother that combined genuine family loyalty with clear-eyed awareness of what Herman had done. He was, by his own account in post-war interviews, not interested in destroying Herman's memory within the family, but he was equally unwilling to pretend that what had happened was anything other than what it was. The result was a distance that served both parties' needs and that left Albert increasingly marginalized from what remained of the Göring family's social world, at precisely the time when the external world was also marginalizing him in more punishing ways. Edda's relationship with her uncle Albert is even less documented than most aspects of her private life, which is saying something given how thoroughly she guarded her privacy. There is no record of a particularly close relationship between them, and the dynamics that kept Emmy and Albert at arm's length probably operated in similar ways for Edda. Albert's story was, in one sense, an implicit rebuke to the family mythology that Edda and her mother were constructing around Herman's memory. The idea that he had been a fundamentally decent man caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing what he could within the constraints of his position. Albert's existence demonstrated that someone with the Göring name living in the same period, facing the same pressures, had made dramatically different choices. This was not a conversation that Emmy was interested in having, and the evidence suggests that Edda was similarly disinclined to pursue it. The result was that the member of the Göring family, with perhaps the most genuinely honourable story to tell, was also the most isolated from whatever fragile sense of family continuity remained. The question of how the Göring family's story has been remembered, interpreted, and contested in German cultural and historical life is an important one that extends well beyond the immediate post-war decades. Germany's relationship with its Nazi past has evolved considerably over the decades since 1945, from the initial periods of denial and suppression through the painful public confrontations of the 1960s and 1970s, when a generation of young Germans began demanding full accountability for what their parents and grandparents had done, through the increasingly sophisticated historical scholarship and public education of the 1980s and beyond. Within this broader cultural evolution, the specific story of the Göring family occupied various positions at various times. Hermann Göring himself was never a figure who attracted the kind of serious historical revisionism that occasionally attached to other senior Nazi leaders, partly because his own conduct at Nuremberg, while impressive in certain forensic senses, had not created the kind of ambiguity that some sought to exploit in the cases of more militarily focused figures. His crimes were too well documented, his personal enrichment too obvious, his role in establishing the regime's criminal apparatus too central. Emmy's memoir attracted criticism precisely because it seemed to be attempting exactly the kind of revisionism that German historical culture was increasingly unwilling to accommodate. Edda's silence was, in contrast, often interpreted more charitably as the dignified reticence of someone who knew that anything she said would be scrutinized for signs of either unacceptable justification or performative denunciation, and who preferred the relative peace of saying nothing at all. The Göring art legacy remained a live issue in German law and culture for an extraordinarily long time after the war. Individual restitution cases continued to wind their way through German courts for decades, with heirs of original owners periodically succeeding in establishing their claims to specific works and occasionally encountering institutional resistance or procedural obstacles that delayed justice by years or decades. The broader question of what German museums and cultural institutions should do about artworks of uncertain provenance accumulated during the Nazi era was a subject of significant and sometimes acrimonious public debate from the 1990s onward. Several major German museums undertook systematic provenance reviews of their collections, a process that, in some cases, led to the identification and return of works that had been in institutional custody for half a century. The Washington Principles of 1998, an international agreement committing signatory nations to the identification and fair resolution of Nazi-era art theft, provided a framework that gave renewed impetus to these reviews and created additional international pressure on institutions that had been slow to act. In this context, the specific question of artworks associated with the Göring collection continued to generate legal activity and public attention long after the principal members of the family who might have had personal stakes in the outcome had died. The cyanide capsule that Hermann Göring used to take his own life on October 15, 1946, was itself the subject of considerable historical investigation because its presence in his cell represented a significant security failure on the part of the Nuremberg prison authorities, and the question of how he obtained it was never definitively resolved during the period of the trial and its aftermath. Various theories circulated in the years following, including suggestions that it had been smuggled in by a sympathetic American guard, that it had been hidden within a piece of equipment or personal item that had not been properly searched, or that Emmy herself had passed it to him during one of their supervised visits. The theory that Emmy had been the courier was investigated and firmly denied by her in the post-war period, and no evidence was ever produced to support it specifically. However, the investigation was never fully conclusive, and the question of the capsule's origin remained a subject of historical debate that periodically resurfaced in books and documentary treatments of the Nuremberg trials. Emmy's denial was consistent and absolute, and most historians who have examined the question have concluded that the weight of evidence does not support her having been directly responsible for its delivery, though the investigation of the precise mechanism of its concealment and passage was never completed to everyone's satisfaction. The children and grandchildren of other prominent Nazi family members face similar, if not identical, challenges to those experienced by the Göring family in the post-war decades, and examining some of these parallel stories illuminates something important about the specific dynamics of the Göring case. Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, chose a path of active, ongoing support for former SS members and open loyalty to her father's memory that stood in stark contrast to the quieter posture adopted by Edda Goering. Wolf Hess, the son of Rudolf Hess, spent decades campaigning for his father's release from Spandau prison and maintained an ambivalent public relationship with the Nazi legacy. Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, wrote searingly honest books denouncing his father and spending his career as a form of public penance for the family name. These various responses to the same fundamental problem, the inheritance of a Nazi father's name and legacy, illustrate the range of positions available and the different choices that people in broadly similar circumstances made. Edda Goering's position, somewhere between Gudrun Himmler's active revisionism and Nicholas Frank's active denunciation, was one of principled but imperfect silence, and it satisfied almost nobody who had a strong view about what she should do. But it was, in its own way, a form of self-preservation that most people who have not faced comparable circumstances are probably not well placed to judge. The role that women played in the Nazi regime as wives, daughters, mothers, and social supporters of its leadership has been a subject of increasing historical attention in recent decades. Earlier historiography often treated these women as passive figures, peripheral to the real centres of power and decision-making, and therefore bearing limited historical responsibility for the regime's crimes. More recent scholarship has challenged this view substantially, arguing that women like Emmy Goering, Ilse Hess, and Margarete Himmler were not peripheral but central to the social fabric that sustained the senior Nazi leadership, that they normalized and legitimized the regime's activities through their presence, their social activities, and their management of the households from which the senior leadership conducted much of its most intimate business. The Göring household at Karinhall was not merely a residence but a political and social salon where significant people gathered and where the texture of elite Nazi life was performed and reproduced. Emmy's role in managing that salon was not politically innocent, even if she was not involved in operational decisions about military strategy or racial policy. The ongoing historical reassessment of women's roles in the Nazi regime has implications for how Emmy Goering's post-war story is judged, and they point toward a more complex reckoning than the relatively mild denazification classification she received suggested. The question of whether Hermann Göring was, as Emmy always insisted, a fundamentally decent man who had been led astray by the circumstances of his time is one that the historical record answers with some clarity, even if the emotional truth of his family's experience was considerably more complicated. The evidence presented at Nuremberg, supplemented by decades of subsequent historical research, establishes beyond serious doubt that Göring was centrally involved in establishing the machinery of Nazi repression, including the creation of the first concentration camps in 1933, the establishment of the Gestapo, the persecution of German Jews through legal and administrative mechanisms, and the planning and execution of aggressive wars that resulted in the deaths of many millions of people. His role in the looting of European culture was well documented and enormous in scale. His personal corruption and enrichment at public expense was extraordinary, even by the standards of the Nazi elite. Whatever his private qualities as a father and a husband, and the accounts of those who knew him personally suggest that he did indeed possess genuine warmth and affection in his family relationships, the historical verdict on his public conduct is not a matter that admits of serious revisionism. Emmy knew the man. History judges the official. The Göring family name today is one of the most loaded surnames in German history, carrying associations that are essentially unavoidable and that have shaped the lives of anyone unfortunate enough to share it with the family by accident of birth or marriage. Germany has a complex legal and cultural framework around names, and it is possible, with appropriate documentation and justification, to apply for a legal name change. Whether any of the Göring family's surviving extended relatives have taken this step is not a matter of public record, but the option exists as a practical response to the burdens that the name imposes. In Germany's cultural and historical discourse, the Göring name appears regularly in connection with the ongoing processes of Nazi-era restitution, historical education, and the broader reckoning with the Third Reich's crimes. And each appearance is a reminder that the families of those who committed atrocities must live with that connection in ways that the perpetrators themselves, who mostly died before full accountability could be rendered, did not. This particular form of intergenerational burden is one of the more morally complex aspects of the post-war German experience, and it applies with particular force to a family whose senior member occupied such a central and visible role in the regime's history. There is a particular irony embedded in the story of Karinhall, the monument that Göring built to his dead first wife, which connects the personal and the historical in an especially revealing way. Göring named his greatest material creation after a woman who had died before the Third Reich was even properly established, who had loved him when he was a wounded, exiled, drug-addicted failure, and whose memory he honoured by filling a building with art. Stolen from the people his regime was persecuting and murdering. Hermann Göring had been, by all accounts, a person of genuine spiritual sensitivity and deep personal loyalty. Whether she would have supported the regime that her husband helped to build had she lived is a question that cannot be answered, though the fervour with which she embraced National Socialism in its early years suggests that the answer might not have been as straightforward as her romantic image implies. What is certain is that the most intimate monument to Göring's personal life was constructed on the foundations of criminal accumulation, that the name of a woman who died of tuberculosis in a Stockholm apartment in 1931 became permanently attached to one of the great centres of Nazi power and looting. The ruins of Karinhall in the Schorfheide forest carry all of this history silently, the personal grief and the public crime fused together in the same broken foundations, covered now by decades of moss and the patient indifference of trees. Emmy's memoir remains the only substantial first-person account from the immediate Göring family of what life was like at the summit of the Third Reich's social world, and whatever its limitations and its self-serving aspects, it is a document that historians continue to use as a source for the texture of elite Nazi life. Her descriptions of Göring's personality, his habits, his relationships with other senior figures, and the social world of Karinhall provide details that are not available elsewhere, filtered through the particular distortion of a wife's love and a widow's grief, but nonetheless containing real information about real events. The memoir has been translated and republished at various points since its initial appearance in 1967, and scholarly references to it appear regularly in the academic literature on the Third Reich's social history and on the roles of women in the Nazi regime. Edda Goering's refusal to write a memoir or to engage substantially with the public discourse about her father's legacy means that the Göring family's story from the inside is essentially Emmy's story, with all the gaps and distortions that entails. We know relatively little about what Edda actually thought, felt, or believed beyond the consistent thread of private statements that her father had been a loving parent and that she was not interested in making public judgments. This reticence is understandable on a human level, even if it is frustrating from a historical perspective. The children of great criminals occupy an impossible position. Whatever they say, they will be criticized either for insufficient denunciation of their parents or for insufficient defense of them, and the option of meaningful silence, of simply declining to perform either role, carries its own costs in terms of public perception and historical record. Edda made her choice and lived with it, and her death in 2018 closed the possibility of any future fuller, accounting from that particular perspective. The story of Hermann Göring's family after World War II is ultimately a story about inheritance in every sense of that word. It is about the material inheritance of stolen art and confiscated wealth, which proved impossible to hold and deeply damaging to attempt to claim. It is about the social inheritance of a name that had become synonymous with a particular brand of flamboyant, extravagant Nazi criminality, which proved impossible to escape and exhausting to carry. It is about the moral inheritance of complicity and proximity to evil, which each family member processed in their own way, some with more honesty than others, some with more courage, and some, like Albert Göring, with an active refusal to accept that the name obligated them to anything other than their own conscience. And it is about the emotional inheritance of love, the particular and irreducible human fact that people can love each other genuinely and deeply even when one of them is a criminal of historical proportions, and that this love does not excuse or diminish the criminality, but that it exists nonetheless as a real human experience that shapes the lives of those who feel it. Emmy loved Hermann Göring and spent the rest of her life measuring everything against that love. Edda loved her father, as children love parents, with the uncritical warmth of early childhood that persists in memory long after adult understanding might complicate it. Albert loved his brother enough to accept his help when it came, even while spending the war years making choices that his brother would never have made. Carin, who died before the worst of it, loved Herman in the fever of early National Socialism, and her bones were moved from country to country and back again as the monuments her husband built for her rose and fell. The Fock family in Sweden eventually got her back quietly in the early 1950s and laid her to rest again in the Swedish soil where she had always belonged. It is perhaps the tidiest ending in the entire story, which was otherwise notably resistant to resolution and closure. The legacy of the Göring family's post-war experience extends into the present in several concrete ways. the restitution process for artworks associated with the Göring collection has not concluded. Cases periodically reach the courts and the headlines, as heirs of original owners identify specific works and seek their return from institutions or private collectors who acquired them in the decades following the war. The story of Albert Göring's resistance activities has attracted renewed scholarly and journalistic attention in recent years, as the project of documenting lesser-known resistance within occupied Europe continues to expand our understanding of the range of choices available to people living under Nazi rule. The question of what the children and grandchildren of Nazi criminals owe to history, whether in the form of testimony, acknowledgement, material restitution, or active engagement with the institutions of commemoration and education, is one that German society continues to negotiate in complex and evolving ways, and the physical sites associated with the Göring family, the ruins of Karinhall, the graves in Sweden, the Munich apartment buildings where Emmy and Edda lived their post-war lives continue to exist as quiet, largely unmarked nodes in the geography of European history. What does the full story of Hermann Göring's family after World War II ultimately tell us? It tells us first that the collapse of the Nazi regime did not represent a clean break for the families of its leaders, but rather the beginning of a different and in some ways equally difficult chapter in their lives. It tells us that justice, even when it arrived in the form of an international tribunal with extraordinary legal resources and undeniable documentary evidence, was incomplete and uneven in its effects, reaching the its principal criminal but leaving the surrounding world in complicated disarray. It tells us that the same surname can mean radically different things in the same historical moment, that Albert Göring's name is both the thing that helped him save lives and the thing that destroyed his ability to be recognized for having done so. It tells us that love, loyalty, and complicity are not easily separable in the real lives of real families, and that the attempt to draw clean lines between innocence and guilt in the households of the Nazi elite encounters the irreducible messiness of human relationships. And it tells us, perhaps most importantly, that history's victims, the families whose art was stolen and whose relatives were persecuted and murdered, were waiting patiently for justice long after the families of the perpetrators had processed their own grief and moved on, that the Kranich Madonna and the thousands of works like it were not abstractions but the specific belongings of specific people whose descendants are still, in some cases, waiting for them to come home. Well, that's it for today's video. The story of Hermann Göring's family after World War II is one of the most layered and humanly complex chapters in the post-war history of Nazi Germany's elite, encompassing extraordinary acts of both complicity and resistance, decades of legal battles, personal grief, and the slow, grinding work of historical reckoning. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, make sure to check out our other videos on what happened to the wives and children of other Nazi leaders after the war ended. There are extraordinary and surprising stories waiting in every direction. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content on the history of World War II. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.